Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Presenting Our Presence. I'm the co-host for this episode. My name is Michelle Durocher. I'm from the Fishing Lake Métis Settlement, and at the university, I work in the president's office as the Executive Operations Coordinator. Presenting Our Presence is a wonderful opportunity to meet some of the incredible Indigenous folks all over this campus and learn more about what they do, what they're passionate about, and just a really nice chance for us to visit. I'm joined today by Kyle Napier and Florence Glanfield. Kyle, would you like to take a minute to introduce yourself? Thank you.
Masi, very excited to join the conversation today. Jessie, as you said, you and I go back years and through different spaces, different institutions, but all in pursuit of learning, of a librarianship, and of revolutionary pedagogical praxis. So very excited to join the conversation today, and very excited also to having just realized that this will be our 50th episode of Presenting Our Presence and launching on our 4-year anniversary, so June 2025. So what a better way to celebrate the occasion. Masi.
Thanks so much, Michelle and Kyle. I'm Florence Glanfield, also a co-host of Presenting Our Presence and a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So honored to be in space with you, Jessie. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself in the way that makes the most sense for you.
Thanks, Florence. Tansin to temptek. Tisinti gasuna kalkutina maganiwigen musputios kagini. Dogna mashanaginiwin. So my name is Jessie Loyer. I'm a member of Michelle First Nation. My dad is Métis. My mom's dad is from Michelle, but he grew up at Enoch, and her mom is from Saddle Lake. And so Cree and Métis, that's kind of where I'm from. I grew up in Calahoo, which is just outside of where the former Michelle Reserve was. So I grew up in my own territory, and I'm really delighted to be back as a librarian here at the U of A, working in my own territory after 11 years working down in Otushkanek, off in Blackfoot territory in Calgary. So I'm here, I'm the Indigenous Engagement Librarian at the University of Alberta.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessie. We're really excited to have you here, joining us, as Kyle said, on our anniversary episode and our 50th episode. So very exciting news around that stuff. So you mentioned that you are the Indigenous Engagement Librarian for the University of Alberta. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means and what does, literacy look like from this Indigenous perspective through your office?
Yeah, so my area is around supporting research for Indigenous people and Indigenous research broadly. So that means that I teach classes in the Faculty of Native Studies around research. I meet with students one-on-one on their research projects. I get to see their brilliant minds at work. I also help faculty think through maybe how they're integrating research into their own work. So broadly, that's kind of my day-to-day. That's sort of what it looks like. But for many years, I've been really interested in this concept of Indigenous information literacy. So information literacy at its core is about how we create, find, use information. So it's a big nebulous topic, right, that we are all engaging in all the time. But I became really interested in what made an Indigenous information literacy different. What were the distinctions in the way that Indigenous people were engaging in this kind of information? And so there's a couple of hallmarks through my research and through the time that I've spent working with people on this. But one of them is that the kinds of formats that we engage in, that we create and use and have to find are much more expansive than sort of print culture. So we often, for students, teach them how to find, a scholarly journal article, and they'll come to us and they'll say, I got to find 3 for my paper. I've got to check off those 3. And that's wonderful and is absolutely a skill to learn. But for Indigenous people, we're often engaging in information literacy that is beyond printed word, right? And so thinking about material culture, how we understand and view beadwork, how we engage in the creation of items. So like hide tanning is an information literacy. It also expands into thinking about how we read like writing prior to colonization. So petroglyphs, wampum belts, winter counts, all of these forms of writing that we often don't talk about as being literacies are a big part of how people make meaning, right? And expanding into that, it's like, what is the relationship to information itself, right? So what is the relationality that we have when we're engaging in that? There's a couple other hallmarks, like things like, what does it mean to have the engaging in research actually affect your body, right? What does traumatic research look like as we're going into residential school records and seeing our relatives in the archive and witnessing what they have gone through? So yeah, it's kind of this other, it's in addition to what we might think of as information literacy, and it really asks us to take care of ourselves and to take care of each other through the process.
Thanks, Jessie, for that introduction to the work that you do here at the University of Alberta. So, as I was listening to all of the components that you mentioned, I wondered, what does a day look like for you? What kind? Who would come and have conversations with you? How do you find the humans that are actually interested in engaging in this work? And what I heard was the way I would describe it holistically: heart, mind, spirit, um, and the physical side. So, all of it, right? So, I'd love to know, what does a day look like for you in this beautiful space that you're creating?
You know, there's something really beautiful about the way that librarianship in an academic library is very seasonal. You know, is very much is tied to what's happening in the school year. Where are we at with you know, with the pressures on students? Do they have a research paper due? Are they in exam period? All of that's going to shift what my day-to-day looks like. But I would say that most weeks I have several meetings with students where they have a really big and audacious idea. They want to write about maybe their grandma and how she took script. And so we've got to think about what those information needs are, right? Like, how do we find the archival materials that support this conversation? How do we find scholarly materials that give it context? And sometimes it's also thinking about, do you want to talk to your grandma's grandma, or do you want to engage in the sort of conversation, the sort of oral history that might support this work too? And so sometimes it's the skills that these students need, you know, like this particular database, here's how you would search it, or here's the terminology that we might want to think through. But oftentimes it's confirming and affirming their own brilliance, right? So Indigenous students are, I mean, I'm always in awe of what they bring to the institution because they have big ideas. They want to ask questions that are thorny and interesting, and sometimes the structure of a research paper is too small for their big idea, right? And so sometimes it's giving them the confidence to say, no, we can do this, right? We can absolutely cite oral evidence in your paper. We can absolutely include a first person story. We'll figure out how to put the context in for that. And so a lot of it is cheerleading, you know, to say you're brilliant, bring that brilliance into this space and fight against the systems that maybe make you feel smaller in that space. So that's a big chunk of my work. I also work on thinking through how the library can be more welcoming to Indigenous people in its various systems. And so that's a big thing, you know, the library, like the university, you know, where we inherit this sort of genocidal legacy that comes with education, just the same as any of us do that work here. So we're dealing with systems that were created for categorization, for dehumanization of Indigenous people, right? And so anything as simple as We use the Library of Congress subject headings here at the U of A, at most academic universities. And, it puts Indigenous people in the history section, right? That's where the majority of the books that you'll find are in the E's. And that says something about sort of the way that we position indigeneity as not being contemporary, as being very much like of a romanticized past. And so oftentimes I'm working with the people in the library and the systems of the library to make those adjustments. I'll give you a good example. So a student came to me and she was talking about a particular book that was about grandmother stories. So 12 grandmothers sharing stories, Indigenous grandmothers from all over the world. And she said, I don't like the way that the library describes this book because the only subject heading that it had was under folklore. And these are these are people with the equivalent of a PhD, right? These are people who are well versed in their work. And so I said, all right, let's change it. I'll send this in. And so I sent it in to my team, kind of said, let's adjust these subject headings. I'm happy to suggest some. They did an amazing job. They adjusted it. They added a subject heading around elders knowledge, things that are a little bit more respectful, but also more accurate. Like, it's just simply not accurate to have folklore be the only way that we might be able to find this book. And so the library is very open to these things, but it's as we come across it, right? Another good example is we were screening a film by an Inuit filmmaker who only has one name. So no first name, last name, just a single name. And instead of just providing the name itself, for the last name, it just had the word null. And I was like, first of all, students are not going to know what this means. And second of all, it's inaccurate, right? And so a lot of times it's coming across these inaccuracies within the system and then having the ability and the flexibility and honestly the authority to say, we're going to fix this right now. There's no need to go through a big process. Let's just make this adjustment. So yeah, I would say, Florence, that's a big part of my week is thinking about how do we come into contact with these systems that are oppressive without even realizing that they're oppressive. Yeah.
Yeah, and those examples are so beautiful, Jessie, because this is what often happens when we're working in these big systems that, as you've described, I mean, we inherit them, but we aren't even aware of the ways in which the systems have been designed to exclude the voices and experiences of Indigenous peoples. And your description of the work you do, I just keep thinking, wow, I could have had if I had had an Indigenous librarian that understood these pieces, even when I was exploring my own work, right? I always felt like because my field is mathematics education, the minute I would say I was Indigenous, I was labeled, oh, you must be interested in ethnomathematics. And I didn't like the phrase ethnomathematics because ethno meant studying people and in my experience, all of the literature talked about the past and we were in museums. And so you're, from an ethnographic perspective. And I kept going, but I'm here, I'm part of this. Where's the living? So it's really interesting to offer the experiences that you have now for our students and how they can work through this at this time.
Yeah, I think about that too. Like, what would it have looked like for me to have seen an Indigenous librarian? I was a student at the U of A, and I was totally scared of the library. I thought, there was a big desk in the Rutherford Library when I was a student here, and it said reference, and I thought that meant that that's where you went for them to check your reference list. I didn't realize it's an information desk, right? And so some of that terminology that we have is such a barrier for people's access because I was like, well, I don't need that. I do need to ask people a question, but I don't know where I do that. It's also like I'm so much of my work and my research has developed in tandem with students' experiences. And I came to this kind of discussion of traumatic research because I was working with a student who's a history student at my former institution, and we were looking through residential school records. And he was from Siksika, and my relatives from Michelle. We were looking through records of the same residential school where both of them had gone. And so they hadn't traveled as far for him, but mine had been brought down there because um, several children from Michelle would go home. They were sent originally to St. Albert, but then because they were close enough that they could find their way home, they would send them farther away. And so we're sitting there and we're looking at these records that are describing both of our ancestors in really dehumanizing ways, and just the reminder that they're children right at this point. And so we're sitting there with this like heaviness, right? We're recognizing the people that we maybe don't know, but we love and they have loved us, right? And it made me think through how for so many people this sort of topic is very arm's length, right? They can be very objective about it, but for many Indigenous students that are engaged in the work, and there's no distance from it, right? It's right in our own bodies, it's right in our own brains. And so building in that sort of self-care and the breaks that are necessary for research, and so much of information literacy is about the processes. And so what is the processes of rest when we're doing research? How do we take care of each other? So it truly kind of developed in relationship with students that were experiencing this alongside me.
We're going to open a little bit of a box here. So, so Jessie, I'm really curious. What is your role?
I'm the Indigenous Engagement Librarian.
Okay, fantastic. So, as the Indigenous Engagement Librarian, and recognizing, your previous experience with other institutions, and even how close you are to U Alberta through Michelle Band, I'm curious what your relationship is like with U Alberta, because you had taken a bit of a leave from your previous institution to visit with U Alberta for a while, and you're bringing some of your experience. Because you were a U Alberta student, you had left, and now you're back. So can you describe some of your experiences? What is it that pulls you back to this institution?
Oh my gosh, you're right, Kyle. It's a can of worms. But yeah, so I went to the U of A as an undergrad because it was close to home. I had grown up in the country. I wasn't ready to move far. I didn't have a vision of going to a different country or anything like that. And so I wanted something that was close. And yeah, I was just really interested in writing. And so I did an English literature degree with a sociology minor. I was here for 4 years. And my first year, I don't think I thought too much about what sort of my own identity was in relation to the university. But when you take an arts degree, you have to do a language of some kind. And so I was like, well, I'll do Cree as my language. That's an option. And so I was really lucky to be in a class with Dorothy Thunder, the great Dorothy Thunder, who's an amazing Cree instructor here still. And it was such a transformative experience because I had grown up with my dad's first language is Cree. He was raised by his grandmother. And so his first language is Cree, and he spoke it around us when we were kids. And so I had a sort of very like simple fluency in it. And then my mom's parents were both Cree speakers, but they spoke two different kinds of Cree. And so they disagreed on certain words. And so they would use them, but then they would fight about what was the correct thing to say. So both my parents come from Cree speaking families. And so it was such a wonderful experience to think about the knowledge that I already had and how it could expand into understanding structure, like grammar, the structure of grammar, and expand my vocabulary, or figure out how a word could be written. I don't know if anybody here is a Cree. I mean, I know Kyle, you've been involved in it, and I know that Cree is kind of around a lot of us all the time. But I remember showing my dad my Cree homework, and he pointed at a word and said, "Well, what's this word? Ecozy?" And it was the word EKOSI, which is ekse, right? That's it. So you use it at the end of a sentence, ekse, and he goes, "Ecozy?" So we think too about, the way that for him, the only Cree class that he got was in an anthropology class where the instructor was non-Indigenous, non-Cree speaker, and was just talking about it as a linguistic structure, right? And relied on the Cree students in the class to help him like give examples. And so what a difference within a generation at the university. So yeah, it was a really wonderful experience to take Cree at the university. Um, and then, yeah, when I was on sabbatical, I was a visiting librarian here because I wanted to spend some time thinking and working with the people that were here. There were some really cool projects that the library was involved in around decolonizing description. So, kind of that idea that I talked about around subject headings, right? How do we make these more relevant and applicable? Because the way that we call things, the way that we name the world is how we understand the world, right? And so if we're using words around savagery or around dehumanization, it's shaping the way that people understand the concept. It was also COVID, so it was a very different, it was like early COVID. And so a bit of a strange time to be visiting, mostly online. But yeah, it's wonderful to be back here. And it's also strange. The institution is big and sprawling and, you know, commits harm all the time for Indigenous people. And so what does it mean to be here and be part of that? That's sometimes quite a heavy burden, right? And I see people nodding. Yeah, we all we all engage in this all the time. It's something as simple as, did a security guard throw, someone that came up on the LRT who wanted to just sleep in our library, did security guard throw them out? Were they causing any harm, or were they just someone who was carrying a lot of bags who wanted us asleep, right? And so, yeah, it's engaging with the ways that we're just causing harm all the time, and we're having to work really hard to make space for our relatives to be in these places of learning. So it's a lot, it's heavy, and then you also think about how the environment is so changed by the space of the university, right? Like we're so close to the river valley, which is, it feels a bit untouched in some ways, which we know it isn't. It's a place of meeting. But the university space, I mean, it's a huge sprawling building. And so what are ways that we introduce gardens to this space to think about what our relationship to the actual land is as we're sitting in a library that's covered in concrete? Yeah, it's complicated. But I'm happy to be here because I also I'm not anonymous. I'll say that. For years in Calgary, I might have run into some relatives. I've got some relatives that are at Sutina, which is the reserve right close to Calgary. But here at the U of A, I'm definitely not anonymous. I went for drop-in. I do library drop-in at First People's House. And one of the elders, in looking at my last name, asked whose granddaughter I was, like listed off my grandmother and then her sisters. And then I said, oh yeah, I'm Lorraine's granddaughter. And she goes, oh, I used to have a really good time with those girls. So yeah, there's no anonymity when you're in your home territory.
So now that's your connection to the institution, and even your bit of your relational connection, and as you'd mentioned before, as you're helping out other learners, it also comes back and helps you. And I've seen that as you've been helping out people, either not Indigenous or non-Indigenous learners who are pursuing information in the topics. And so, patterns and themes, what I've noticed your interests are in information literacy, language revitalization, supporting others learning. I know you're very passionate about that, but there's something we haven't talked about, and that is your passion for the arts. So So what has been going on with dance? What has been going on with poetry? How have these arts been following you? I imagine it's a lot more challenging to embrace those arts lately, but this is your story to tell.
Yeah, I think that it's such a beautiful part of how we're connected to each other, art, and I think it's really cool to see what people are doing and to be involved in it. Been really lucky. So a friend of mine, Connor McNally, put together a documentary about the artist George Littlechild. It's a beautiful documentary. It follows his life and his works, and it's just a really wonderful meditation on the kind of like riotous, beautiful, colorful work that George Littlechild is known for, and the person behind it. And I was really honored because one of the things that Connor had done was he commissioned Maria Buffalo, who's a writer from Muscatcheese, to write a poem about George Littlechild. And then it had been translated into Cree, and then he asked me to read the Cree narration for it. And so yeah, like you're saying, I do that. I'm a strong defender of Cree and using Cree in everyday language and using it with my kid, and we should normalize it. And so I was really happy to take part in that and to narrate this film, which is such a beautiful film. Like so happy to just be a small part of that process. But it's really cool to think about the way that art really informs our experiences. Like I went to library school at the University of British Columbia. And I don't know if anyone have seen Edgar Heap of Birds. He's an artist. He does place-based installations, and he creates signs that look like just regular signage, right? They look like everyday, like highway signs or signs that you might encounter in a parking lot, but they are usually like some sort of a political statement. And so one of the installations that is at the campus at UBC is a number of signs that say, "Hello, your host today is," and then the name of a nation, but it's flipped around like you would see on an ambulance, right? So sort of that mirrored version. And it's so interesting because so many people just think that that is like an informative sign on campus. They're like, "Ah, yes, my host today is Squamish. Ah, my host today is Musqueam." But it's such a cool concept of thinking about not only sort of avoiding the silencing that often happens when we talk about land acknowledgement and host communities, but also for it to be sort of like cheeky and silly, like this is a sign like any other. And for most people, they'll just take it at face value. And I find that kind of art really, really interesting, really cool, like the sort of interventions into our everyday space. I think that's really charming and really thought provoking. I find it cool. Yeah.
So, thank you very much for sharing on that. So tell me what have things been like with the Prairie Indigenous Relationality Network?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a director of the Prairie Indigenous Relationality Network. It's a group of prairie scholars who are in lots of different disciplines, everything from political science to religious studies, a wide range of things. And these scholars are all focused in some way on the concept of relationality. So what's our connections? How are we connected to each other and to information and to things? And we just got a big SSHRC grant last year, a SSHRC partnership grant. And so with that, we have a project called Critical Approaches to Indigenous Relationality. So what it's doing is saying, okay, what are the ways that Indigenous relationality contributes to society, right? How does this actually shape the worlds that we're in? And so there's 12 sub-projects that exist under it. There's everything from a prison arts project that people are doing to documentary film stuff with youth. There's archival research into residential schools that's going on. There is like biography of amazing people. So people spending the time to kind of build out biographies. The project that I have as part of it is related to digitization capacity building. So training people how to digitize their own cassette tapes. Because as we know, I'm sure you've probably seen it in people's attics and basements, boxes that are falling apart of really precious materials. Someone interviewed an elder and had a cassette tape, and then it got shoved into a box. And so it's giving people the tools and the skills to digitize their own stuff so that they can decide what they want to do with it. It doesn't have to get sent away to a company, and it doesn't have to get ingested into a database by a university, but you get to decide, right? Who holds it, the controls in your own hands. So that's my project within the bigger project there. But yeah, it's really a chance for people to, it's at its core, it's got sort of a visiting methodology. So in every one of our meetings, we try and leave space for people to visit. So whether that's a very long lunch or a chance for people to sit together so that it's not very scheduled necessarily, but it also includes things like including childcare when we meet, right? So people can bring their families, they don't have to leave their kids behind for a big chunk of time. And so it's little moments like that that really lead up to hopefully a space that is able to allow people to visit, but also to slow down and to be sustained by the project rather than drained by it, because so often research can really take a lot out of us. So what makes it sustainable is essentially what we're trying to achieve. Yeah.
So I've got one last question for you. I don't mean to hog up all this space here, but I want to tease out that prognosticator in you. So you've been on the cutting edge of Indigenous librarianship for quite a while, for more than a decade, it seems. And so you've seen a lot of changes in the space, including how knowledge keepers are referenced, elders, and even how dreams are referenced. And so I'm curious, what do you foresee on the horizon of Indigenous librarianship?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. When I think about, so my first job in the library was 2009, and then I became a professional librarian in 2012. And when I started, I think there was a survey that went around, and it said there was 25 Indigenous librarians in Canada, and we pretty much all knew each other. That's a small community. You know what everyone's up to. You know what's going on. And so I think just out of necessity, I was trying to write about these things. I was interested in talking about them. I wanted to see what people thought. And my first ever thing that I wrote as a librarian was called Not a Munial Librarian, to talk about what does it mean to have that presence in the library at the desk, right? To have a student come up and I know exactly what they're talking about, right? Maybe they're talking about status and they're mentioning, being on a membership list versus being on a general list, something like that, right? And understanding what they mean. I think that was one of the first things that I was trying to articulate. It's like this presence is so necessary, right, in the library. And so, yeah, so that's kind of where I came from. I was lucky to come up through UBC because, my first job was working with other Indigenous librarians. I worked with the Métis librarian, Sarah Dupont, Hulchuk librarian, Kim Lawson. And so I was surrounded by these brilliant people who had a really wonderful ethic of care in what they did and wanted libraries to be spaces of visiting and community. And Kim, for example, for years she would go to film festivals and purchase DVDs and bother, indie filmmakers for their work. And so she had built up a fantastic film collection at that library. So the kind of collection development that, is very different from what we usually do in a library. So where I came from is really that background. There have been wonderful changes. Some of it is that we just have so many more librarians. People are coming up. Even the U of A library has an Indigenous internship program. So we will pay for an Indigenous person to go to library school for 2 years. And during that time, they also get a chance to work with us in multiple departments in the library so they can get experience. They have mentorship opportunities. They can go to conferences. It's really a chance to set them up and get them going. And there have been some really fantastic librarians that have come through that program who are, they're superstars, right? They are just set on their way, and it's so lovely to have supported them. I've got two students in the program right now, and hopefully a new one is going to join us in September. But um, I think that it's just also like building that capacity, right? Making sure that Indigenous people know that librarianship is a career that could be interesting for you. It's not necessarily just doing story time to little kids. I mean, it could be if that's what you're into, but it could be work in repatriation, right? You could be involved in museum repatriation. You could do language revitalization. You could do cataloging if that's what you're into. So yeah, it's an expansive set of tools, I think, to engage in the world. And yeah, I think it's so exciting to think about other people joining me. It's wonderful to not be the only one. I'll say that. Like it's fantastic to be in a place where my direct supervisor is an Indigenous librarian. I've never had that experience, and it's the world of difference it makes, truly. I think where the field is going now is really embracing two things. One is that expansive formats, right? Where we're still moving away from, the written word as the core center of what we know. I think it's making space for oral histories. We see the way that people are encouraging or really embracing star stories, for example, right? We've seen an explosion in that kind of discussion of like, what are the stories of the stars? That as a literacy that we can develop. I think there's a real hope around land-based education. I think about hide camps, right, as a place where there's language happening and there's cultural transmission. There's so much that's in there that's not just simply about like, and what's the next step in the hide, right? And so that's really exciting to me. I have a 2-year-old. He's named in Cree. His name is Nipi, which means water. And I think, I see the way that he also has access to children's books that I didn't. Certainly my dad was a teacher, and so we had a lot of books, and he made sure to make sure that there was Indigenous kids books as much as possible around us, whether they were, self-published on the res or, I think Pemmican Books was making books in the 80s. And so we had those. But he has such a plethora of choices now, and books that are written in Cree that are beautiful, beautiful books. And so that also changes, I think, this next generation is their literacy is so informed by having books that feature people who are named like them, and the language around it and the concepts. It's just so second nature for them. And yeah, what a gift to be able to like not keep up with the number of Cree language books that are out there. That's like, it's so fantastic. And then the last thing I'll say about the future is I think that we are in a space where we really have to grapple with what AI means to our communities. There's sometimes like a wholehearted embrace of it. And I think that we have to have caution as we engage with it, because it's hungry. It'll totally consume our knowledges and spit them out for consumption. And I think we have to be really careful about what we make available online. And so some of these practices of refusal, I think, will be very important, knowing what ceremonies we don't share, what information needs to be shared in person. I think we're getting a lot more fluent in understanding some of that. And I think that will continue to happen, because I think there's always people that are trying to replicate information, and there's a real hunger. So I'll give you an example of that. So a couple of months ago, it was like last year, I believe, there were all of these language books that popped up on Amazon. I don't know if you remember. Yeah. And it was like the 100 most frequent words in Cree, or like the 100 most frequent adjectives in Cree. And it was not only for Cree languages, like I remember seeing one in Mohawk and Dene and just all these language books. And if you're someone like me that's like, oh my gosh, a new book has come out, let me grab this. I'm unfortunately a book hoarder as a librarian. And so I was looking into these, but it started to be a conversation on social media that this is not quite right. Like something, these words are not translated quite right, or why do we even have this section? And it really came to a head when it was the 100 most frequent, I think it was adverbs in Cree. And someone was like, I don't think this actually exists as a linguistic category in Cree. Like it's not really, it'll be incorporated into the verb, right? If you have an adverb, it rarely would sit on its own. And 100 of, it didn't seem quite right. And then it became very obvious that these were being AI generated. These were like slop, right? That was being generated by AI tools. And so I think what I worry about is like just building up people's critical literacies around understanding how AI functions, understanding how it can often be theft of our own knowledges, and understanding how by feeding into it, we keep that system going. So that's going to be a big one, I think, in the next couple of years for us.
Well, I think Michelle, would you like to pop in here? And I think we're near to the end of our time. And please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. Yes. So thank you so much for sharing, Jessie. It's been so informative. Just, I don't know, I'm enjoying this little joke to myself about how informative you are. So I think it's really cool that you're talking about the projects and stuff that you've got going on, because again, like we don't see those as traditional ways of information literacy, library usage, and the work that you do is so important. And as everybody else here has stated, I wish I would have had an Indigenous librarian when I was in school. Because I took classes that were adjacent, like I took some coursework that was, about like Indigenous authors and that kind of stuff, right? So like I had those little bits where I tried to incorporate as much of that into my education as I could, because, it just seems so foreign to have Indigenous anything in a post-secondary institution. That all felt like that's home things. My father also is first language is also Cree. So those kinds of things didn't feel like they were, academic things. So it's so cool now to see this incorporation of oral teachings, beadwork, as you were talking about the project with learning how to digitize our histories and our stories. It's going to be so important for the next generation of Indigenous learners that come through this institution. My hope is that it makes it less ivory tower. It makes it less intimidating, because I think we can all speak on that. It was intimidating to come to a university where it's not built for us. So I hope you also have more opportunities to branch out and be in more spaces. And it's so great that you're at First People's House and doing that, but just to even this, because there's students who don't go to First People's House yet, and they're not understanding how much they have, how much support they could have if they're not looking, they don't know where to find you, right? So I just hope that it just gets more widely known that you guys are there and that you're there for them, and to be a support to them, but to be a partner. And I'm just really excited to see where things go in the future. So thank you so much for being here today. Hi.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. Kyle, would you like to say a few words of gratitude?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've seen the work that you do, Jessie, and so, the gratitude doesn't just come from me, Michelle, Florence, or any of the listeners of the episodes. It comes from the students that you've worked with over geez, uncountable years, really, at this point. But I've seen your work, and I've been one of those people who has gone to you, Jessie, in request of information, and the feeling that I had walking away from that conversation was one of renewal, refreshment, and just like having a new perspective on the research topic, and so just a testament to your a testament of gratitude to your ongoing work and passions here, Jessie. So must see.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And Jessie, we're going to invite you to say the final word. Um, but I also wanted to just thank you for sharing all of the ways that you came into the work, because I love that beautiful story. Um, and how this whole time together really resonated with me. My late mother was a library technician, and she did a diploma in library technician, whatever they call it, a diploma, um, in the 1970s. And she worked not only in school libraries, but a post-secondary library in her career. And I think about the role that she had in those libraries as this beautiful Métis woman and who connected with kids. And in the 70s, it was books. There was, we were all in the history, but she had spaces and libraries for all of those Indigenous kids that were in my school and in the school K to 12 schools that she worked in and in the post-secondary. So I just want to honor your work and thank you for helping me to connect with the story that my mother lived by in her ways of working in the library. So thank you so much for being with us. It's been an honor. And now I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Florence, that's so lovely. I mean, I love hearing stories of these Indigenous library people, and sometimes there's a sense that, this is new, right? Because of the TRC, we're going to put in these internships and we're going to change the way our libraries work. But these, there are ladies working in libraries and men, but a lot of women who worked in libraries that had little libraries out of their houses, that had book clubs, that were deeply involved in this work for many years. And it's so lovely to hear about that. I really want to honor your mom in all the things that she did. A really cool book, actually, if people are interested in sort of that history, it's called Paper Talk. It's by Brendan Edwards. And it talks about how for years, so the book is it's a historiography, goes up till 1960, but it's all about how Indigenous people have wanted libraries, are interested in print culture. People saw it as a tool, and they wanted, their kids to be literate as another tool to help them. And not every community, many people refused it for lots of good reasons, but it also challenges the way that they were. It shows the way that they were met with challenges, right? They'd ask for libraries, and Indian Affairs would give them essentially like a propaganda library. Isn't it great that farming exists? Isn't it great? Aren't the RCMP the best? And so it's such a cool reminder that this is a much longer legacy, right? I'm very, very lucky to be a librarian. I'm very honored to be part of that legacy of information workers. And there's lots of people, like I look at Michelle, both our dads are people that are interested in things like genealogy, and there's those stories that go along with it. And those people are libraries in and of themselves. And so it's so cool to think about libraries in that most expansive way, right? I work in a very specific kind of library, but Indigenous people are libraries in and of themselves. And we have our information literacies. We're experts in it. And it's a great reminder that every day we engage in this work in our bodies, in our minds, in our spirit, and to take care of it ourselves as we go through the world and think through how information is affecting us. But thank you all. What a treat to spend time with you all today.
Exe, Ikosi.
Isn't that so cute?
I love that story.